This video is brought to you with support from my patrons on Patreon.
Hey everybody, it's Jimmy from the DIY and Digital, and I've got a new section of layout here. You can see I've got some track laid on it, and I've got some foam. We're gonna go over the new old track plan. We're gonna go over putting the foam because I have a elevation change here. So got a lot of stuff to get to today. It's gonna be a lot of fun. The old layout's back, guys. Welcome back, everybody. It's getting pretty exciting here in the brand new train room. You can see that I have the old section that you've already seen me build before, but I have this whole new section here. Now, I have some different things going on, including, as you can see, I don't have this attached yet. So we're gonna go over why I haven't done that. But first, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the new old track plan. It's a new and improved version of my original layout. It's been over 2 years since the original DIY and Digital Railroad ran, and I still absolutely love the basics of this track plan. Now, there were some compromises that I did have to make when I originally built that, so when I had the opportunity to rebuild this layout and make it better, I decided to go for it. This is the reimagined DIY and Digital Railroad. It is a 110-inch by 80-inch L-shaped layout on 2 hollow core doors. It does have a section of double track main as well as some elevation changes, one of them being a 2.5% grade climb and one being a slightly unrealistic compromise of a 4% grade incline. So let's hop into the cab and take a virtual tour of the new DIY and Digital Railroad. We begin our tour at the yard. Now, this is a stub-in yard. It does have 4 tracks for car storage as well as a 5th track for locomotive servicing. We're going to go ahead and cross over a double crossover. This facilitates a yard lead and a passing siding on the layout as well. We head into Riverbed Canyon. That's going to go over what is going to be the signature scene of this layout, and then we begin to head up the 2.5% grade up to the town of West Valley. We slow down as we take the final turn into West Valley, and what we're going to see first is a small fuel depot that's going to actually be the small fuel depot 3D print that you can actually purchase off my Etsy store. And then you're also going to have another track that goes to a general freight warehouse. We're going to cross over a road right here that's going to be the main street in West Valley before we cross over the Riverbed Canyon Bridge. Once we cross over the bridge, we slow down a great deal as we begin to head down the 4% grade that's going to take us back down into the East Valley industrial area. This is going to be a cool scene because it's going to be a canyon of sorts between these 2 mountains, and you're really going to have some immersive scenery for the layout itself. We're coming to the bottom of that 4% grade. I know it's unrealistic and no real world train is going to have that 4% grade, but sometimes you have to make compromises on your model railroad, and it may lend itself to doing some helper operations on the layout. We head over another double crossover that is the entrance to the industrial area. It's also going to serve as our yard lead and a passing siding. You can see we pass the first industry, which is a warehouse of sorts. I actually think I'm going to make that into a lumber mill. And then we head into the chemical plant and another warehouse. And you can see a locomotive right there working the industries. And we begin to come back around the big curve at the end of the layout right here. And you can see we are now back to where we started. We're heading into the yard area. So that is the revamped DIY and Digital Railroad 1.0. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. I am really just so incredibly excited because this layout had a little bit of everything and it looks like it's going to be that way again. So I'm super excited to be tackling this layout again. But one thing I want to talk about is how I did the foam, because the last time I did this layout, I already had the track in place and I already had all the base in place. So I wasn't able to show you how I put the base in place. And this is the only layout design I've ever done with an elevation change. So I want to show you guys how I did that. I start off by bringing in my foam base. I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch 4x8 sheet of extruded foam and then cutting it to size. Rather than just relying on measurements, I went ahead and just laid it across the top and used the board as my reference and cut the lines to suit. Once I cut the boards, I grabbed the track that I was going to use for this section and began to place it in kind of a test fit, but it wouldn't be a full test fit simply because I'm going to be having elevation. But I just wanted to make sure that I had all the pieces that I needed and that I could make the track plan successfully. It also helps when you have something like Kato Unitrack that you can test fit and see what works in real life, and it helps out with your final track plan. Once I have that all laid out, I take a pen and I draw a very rough outline of the track, specifically where my elevation changes are going to be. Now, what I'm going to do here is it's kind of inspired by the Woodland Scenics foam risers. I'm going to be making my own foam risers here. I know a lot of people, and myself included, I've done this on another layout, build this part out of wood or plywood or things like that. I'm going to be using foam risers here because it's pretty easy to adjust, and the reason that I straight up didn't go for Woodland Scenics risers is because one of my rise over runs is not available from Woodland Scenics. That 2.5% grade is not available. They have 2% and it goes to 3%. So I needed a custom grade. So I'm drawing out where all of the foam platforms that my track is going to sit on, the sub-roadbed that it's going to sit on, is going to be. Next, I begin removing the track, and we're removing it in larger sections simply because it's easier to move that way and it's easier to put back together when I'm continuing to test. One thing you guys know I always harp on when you're building a layout is testing, 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 testing. The more you test, the less issues you're going to have because you're going to be able to correct them along the way rather than getting your whole layout done and then all of a sudden you have issues that you're going to either have to rip up scenery for or just deal with. So testing all throughout your construction process is crucial to having a well-running layout. Now, once all the track is removed, I can begin to build up the elevation change bases. And the big one I want to build up is essentially where my town and two of my industries are going to sit in this particular section. So what I'm going to do is I need to build it up to 2 inches above the main level, which actually means that I need to build it up 2.5 inches from this particular foam base, because the foam base on my other section is a 1-inch section. Now, the reason that I did that is there is a very good piece of advice, and I can never remember exactly where I heard it from, but you got to remember that your railroads in the real world are always not at the bottom of the scene, and to make some things more realistic, you want to show some stuff that's below the elevation of your track. So by having the entire thing sitting 1/2 inch below and then building the track up above it, I'm going to have some space below that I can put scenery and I can have little dips and things like that. I can make the terrain more natural rather than it looks natural and great until you get to the track and then everything's flat. So once I get this built, it is time to start creating my risers. Now, I have a ton of extra 1/2 inch foam from building this thing, and that's what I'm going to make my risers out of. Now, because I have to do this in 1/2 inch chunks, I have to do this a little bit differently than if you were using the Woodland Scenics product. But I start off by simply cutting a bunch of these little blocks that I can stack and slowly build the elevation on. And what I'm doing here is just essentially building the base of the support. Now, we're going to have to do a little bit more modification than this, but this is how you start with this. So you're just going to cut a ton of these little blocks out, and you're going to just start putting them together and start slowly building your elevation change. Now, one thing that I have here that you can't see is right behind the camera, literally, as I have my layout plan up on SCARM so I can see where the hard points of elevation are. So where I see a 1/2 inch, where I see a 1 inch, where I see a 1.5 inch, and where I see 2 inches is where I have these blocks placed. Now the 2 inches is the final rise, so where the big section of foam is, but the 3 stack right there is the 1.5 inch, the 2 stack is the 1 inch, and the single stack is the 1/2 inch rise. So, and remember, I'm doing that because it has to be actually one less than the actual rise, because the foam that's going to be sitting on it, that's going to be actually the sub-roadbed, is a 1/2 inch thick as well. So you're adding another 1/2 inch of thickness to that. Now, once I have all of these placed, I can start cutting out my sub-roadbed. And I'm really doing this rough, and it's not going to look very clean, but at the same time, that looks natural. So at first, I was really concerned with getting some really clean edges, but then I really thought about it. I was like, as long as I have enough room to run the track, it's going to look a lot more natural, because a lot of times when crews are building this, they're cutting out just enough for the train to pass, just enough clearance and right-of-way for the train to pass. So there's really not much beyond that in terms of aesthetics, except for maybe in a few situations. So having it look natural and a little rough is going to be totally okay, if not a little prototypical. Now here is where I'm going to be evening things out. Now what I do here is I grab a small strip of scrap foam and I start cutting little bitty strips, ones that are less than a 1/2 inch wide, basically less than what just sticking a strip would be. And these are going to be kind of my levelers. So I'm going to be cutting a bunch of these and just kind of wedging them in to make sure that we get a nice even slope, because we don't want the track bending and bowing as the train goes over it. So in between the major support points, where the major elevation points are, we're going to have these little sections that I'm cutting out custom, and I'm going to be filling them in. And once I get them all selected and put out properly, I'm going to have them all glued in place as well. Now the last thing I need to do is I actually have a small section that's a little bit of a gap, because I'm using the spare foam from the layout base. I need to cut a little spare section that can fit in between these two sections of the sub-roadbed, just to kind of join them together. Now I am going to be using paper mache over all of this, so when it gets to the point where the track's going to be laid down, this is already going to be covered and look smooth. I just have to get this to be a nice even elevation change and not a big bump. So I'm going to be using some risers in addition to a 1/2 inch foam section, just to make this as smooth as possible. And you can see that I also repeat the process on my other section as well. This one is a lot smaller, but it is a lot steeper, so less risers, but I still have to be a bit more careful and make sure that I don't have any sagging foam sections for that. And now I can begin gluing all of the risers in place, and I'm very careful to just kind of stack them along the side as I go, and just slowly glue them in place and make sure that I'm not misplacing anything. Because once I have them in place, I just want to sit them and dry. I don't want to have to do any adjustments. I also need to glue the little area where the siding for the fuel depot is going to be. I am going to have that drop off an elevation behind it, so I'm literally just kind of making a little mini peninsula for that siding to go out right there. So that's where that's going to go. I've already cut the pieces and custom fit them to fit them right next to this section of the sub-roadbed. And I'm just gluing those in place and making sure they're good. I'm also not gluing these down to the base themselves, because I am going to have to drill through them for a feeder. Now it's time to start gluing down all of the sub-roadbed and the supports. We start off with the section that's going to connect to the old layout, and then we begin gluing all of our supports. Now there are a lot of supports, and you have to glue each layer of foam to the previous one, so this is a whole lot of gluing. This part's definitely time consuming, but it's more than worth it. Now, because we're not going to have a feeder on this particular section of track, because it's going to be right off of the curves, we're just barely off of it, we can go ahead and glue the sub-roadbed in place. Now you'll notice that I've only placed the latex caulk onto the sections where you have the significant elevation changes. In this case, you have the 1 inch, the 1.5 inch, and the 2 inch sections. So I'm only placing glue there. This just makes sure that I have a nice increase in elevation. Now, I have not glued down this lower section of the sub-roadbed and the elevation change, specifically because I have to do a feeder wire through at this point. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm basically just drilling into the foam, and then I'm going to where I hit and mark the door. Hollow core doors are great, but one drawback of them is that they are a little difficult to wire because they're hollow on the inside, which means the wire has plenty of opportunity to be able to go all over the place, which means I can't just stick it straight through, whereas if I was using plywood, I could do that no problem. So what I'm going to do here is I'm basically going to wire through the foam, and then I'm going to lift up. As you remember, I haven't glued this down to the base yet, and then I'm going to thread the wire through using some techniques that I know that make wiring through a hollow core door a lot easier. And we're going to go through that on a later video. So here we are gluing together the joiner section for the 2 sections of sub-roadbed. You can see me just applying a bunch of glue and a bunch of feeders, and basically I'm just kind of feeling this out. There's no real rhyme or reason. I just want to make sure that I have it nice and level. And then I'm going to go through sticking the rest of the sections through, making sure that they have glue on them, in this case latex caulk, and I'm able to get them through. Now it's time to put all of our little support wedges that are going to even out our grade increase and keep our sub-roadbed from sagging in place. And basically we're just going to put glue on each side of them, and we're just kind of squish them in there and make sure that the rise and is even. We don't want to have it going all over the place, and by having the track on here, it's pretty easy to see where it's even and uneven, because you're going to get a little gap where it's uneven. So that's one reason why I still have the track on here. And you'll also notice that I'm weighing down the other section with just a spare battery from one of my drills, and this makes sure that the connection point stays even as well. Now the last thing that I am going to do is I'm going to put the frame for the mountains. Now this is a relatively new method. You know, typically when I build my mountains, I just layer foam on top of foam on top of foam, because I'm usually building mountains that are like the mountains of Appalachia that have a ton of trees, so they're not going to have a ton of detail. They're not like the Rockies, they're not like the Cascades and Sierra Nevadas. They typically, you don't see a lot of the ground cover, you don't see a lot of the rocky faces. So but what I'm doing here is basically I'm cutting a vertical kind of frame, and I'm going to make a 3-point frame for this mountain, because I'm going to be using the basket weaving technique to make these mountains this time. I wanted to have a bit more organic shape, and basket weaving is a great way to do that, and I'm going to be doing that in a later episode. It'll be in a layout update coming up soon, so be on the lookout for that. Now you can see that I cut out everything. I make sure that everything's good. I have marks for where I need to cut, and then I'm just cutting out all of the shapes right here just to make sure that we are good. And I'm going to fit these together, and they're going to kind of hold each other up for now. And I just trimmed a little bit of excess off, and I used some latex caulk to secure them in place, and these will pretty much just dry right in place. And I do the same thing for the hills that I want behind the town and the industry right here. These are a little bit lower, and you can also see that I'm using some more scraps just to kind of hold these in place. The last thing I'm going to do is I need a really tall mountain that's going to be behind it that gives it kind of that canyon essence. So if you've ever been on a highway through the Appalachian Mountains, whether it's up in the Blue Ridge or you're talking about something up in New England or something like that, whenever they have to go through a mountain, the mountains aren't nearly as tall as the Rockies, the Sierra Nevadas, or anything like that. So it's a lot of time, it's a more economical just to blast a section through the mountains rather than cutting a tunnel. So you'll have a lot of blasting that goes on. As a matter of fact, if you drive through, you can see the lines where they dropped the charges through and they did the boreholes for. So what I'm going to do here is basically say essentially they blasted through this mountain, and it's going to kind of look like it just has a section cut out of it. Now it's going to be a long time ago, so it's going to have a lot of overgrowth, but you're still going to have some rock faces right here. But that's what this is going to look like, and that's why this mountain right behind it is so much taller. It's really all one mountain, but it's more of a continuation. So, and we'll go over some cool little details that you can put on that later on in this layout build. And there you go. Now I can set it to dry. We've got a lot more work to do on this layout, and that's going to be in another layout update. I'm really excited to show you that to you guys. So there you have it, guys. The brand new layout, the DDRR 1.0 revived. I'm so excited about doing this layout again, guys. You have no idea. So thank you guys so much for watching. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. They are listed right here. They have known about this change coming for a while now. They've known about the layout coming for a while. So if you'd like to be in the know about things before you hear them on the channel, you can check that out for as little as $1 a month. And if you're all the way up to the $5 a month level and you're a 3D printer, you get models that every month that you can print yourself. So thank you guys so much for watching. It's going to be a very exciting model railroading season as we're heading into the fall and winter up here in the Northern Hemisphere. So thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, and happy railroading. The thing about this is that I'm rocking in a chair. You know, downstairs I was in a stool. Whee! Woo! Okay.